Morning mist rolled low across the edge of the reserve where the rescue camp slept under tarps and rusted tin, the smell of wet earth and smoke drifting through the air. Mira moved slowly through the fog, her arms wrapped around a bundle of soaked fur that shivered against her chest. The cub was lighter than she expected, all ribs and trembling muscle, his eyes wide and unblinking, like a creature still caught between two worlds. She could feel his heartbeat racing fast against her jacket, as if he had been running for miles, trying to escape something bigger than the storm that brought him here. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, flooding the animal pens and tearing loose branches from the trees. The forest had turned into a maze of brown water and broken nests. When one of the rangers found the cub alone near a fallen tree, he thought at first it was a puppy, its coat matted with mud and blood. But when Myra saw the shape of the ears, the narrow jaw, the faint pattern of stripes across the damp fur, she knew exactly what he was and why the others hesitated to touch him. He was not a pet, not a stray, but a predator born from the heart of the jungle, and that meant danger. Myra carried him anyway, ignoring the warning looks. As she passed through camp, she laid him on an old towel by the heater and knelt beside him, her hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of what she had just chosen to do. The cub hissed low, a sound that did not match his size, then turned his face away from her hand, his eyes reflecting the dim orange glow of the heater. She whispered softly, "You are safe." Now, though she was not sure if he could hear or understand, maybe the words were more for herself than for him. The wind rattled the metal roof as the night deepened. Mira stayed awake, watching him breathe, counting each rise and fall of his small chest. The rain drummed a steady rhythm outside, and for a moment she imagined the cub's mother somewhere out there searching for him, maybe calling softly through the trees until the forest swallowed her voice. Mira closed her eyes and wondered if she had done the right thing, taking him from the wild, even if the wild had already taken everything from him. By dawn the storm began to fade, a pale light spreading across the horizon. The cub stirred and stretched, one paw brushing against her arm, his claws tiny but sharp enough to draw a thin red line. Mira smiled, despite the sting she had spent years tending to broken wings, burned paws and starving strays, but never a creature like this, never something so fierce and fragile all at once. The mist outside thickened again, wrapping the camp in white silence, and for the first time since the storm began, Mira felt a quiet warmth rise inside her, something close to hope, as she whispered again, almost to the wind, "You are safe now, little one." The cub refused the milk that morning, turning his head away each time Mira brought the bottle close, his jaw clenched tight as if defying the world that had changed around him. He let out a rasping growl, so small and broken that it almost sounded like a cry. Mira sat cross-legged beside him, her back against the wooden crate, watching the stubborn rise of his chest. She knew that wild things fought kindness as if it were a trap, because kindness meant staying, and staying meant danger. The camp was waking behind her, voices rising, the clatter of metal dishes and the crackle of a new fire. She could hear the others muttering about her choice. They said the cub was too young, too wild, too hungry for human hands. They said one day he would remember what his teeth were for, but Myra shut out their noise, focusing only on the slow tremor in the cub's flanks. She dipped her fingers in the milk and held them out. He blinked his golden eyes, wary but curious, the scent of the milk sweet and strange in the damp air. He licked her fingertip once, hesitated, then bit down, not hard, just enough to test the boundary of her patience. She did not pull away, she only smiled gently. "You will learn," she whispered, though her finger throbbed faintly. With heat he glared at her, as if deciding whether she was predator or prey, but his eyelids grew heavy, and soon he collapsed against her boot, exhausted from a battle he could not name. His breathing steadied, his tail twitching in small dreams. Mira watched him for a long time, feeling something inside her shift, like a door opening later. When the rain eased, she carried him outside. The camp clearing was alive with the scent of wet leaves and ash, the world washed clean. She placed the cub on the ground, the mud squelched beneath his paws, and for a moment he froze, unsure of the earth itself. Then he stumbled forward, nose pressed to the ground, sniffing everything with the awkward clumsiness of a creature learning the map of a new life. His fur caught the light in uneven patches, revealing faint stripes that shimmered gold beneath the damp. Mira caught her breath at the sight. It was the first time she saw what he truly was, something fierce, something ancient. The others gathered at the edge of the clearing, watching her with folded arms. One of them called out, "Mira, that thing will grow teeth sharper than knives." "You cannot keep him. He belongs to the forest." Mira turned but said nothing. Her eyes followed the cub as he explored his small patch of freedom. He tripped over a root, rolled onto his back, and made a startled sound somewhere between a growl and a laugh. The rangers shook their heads and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet. As the cub crawled back toward her, muddy and unsteady, she reached out and brushed a leaf from his fur. He leaned briefly into her touch, and though it lasted only a heartbeat, it was enough. Mira felt something deeper than resolve settle inside her, a promise that she would see this through no matter how sharp his teeth became. By the third week, the cub had begun to follow Mira wherever she went, padding softly behind her as her footsteps had become his compass. The morning sun painted gold across his fur, and though his legs were still wobbly, he moved with the silent grace of something remembering how to hunt. She felt his presence like a shadow, one that breathed and blinked and sometimes betitched. Morning, she swept the wooden floor of the supply tent while he stalked her broom, his eyes locked on the moving bristles. She would shift the handle just enough to tease him, and he would leap, claws flashing a silent blur of play and instinct. Sometimes he missed and landed in a pile of blankets, tangling himself until he gave a sharp squeak of frustration. Mira would laugh quietly, though no one else did, the sound soft and full of something she did not want to name it. Night, the camp quieted, and the forest hummed with the low music of insects and wind. The cub curled near her boots, his tail flicking lazily in sleep. He had started chewing on things, bits of rope, pieces of cloth, the corner of her notebook once. He had tried to bite the metal zipper of her jacket and nearly pulled his tooth loose. She touched the spot gently after he whimpered, telling him it would be fine. "You are growing, little hunter," she said softly, though her chest ached at the thought of what growing meant. The others began to notice the bond between them. Whispers moved through camp like smoke. They said Mira had forgotten what wild blood was, that she was taming something that should never be tamed. One of the older rangers, a man with scars across his arms, told her to keep her distance before the cub learned to test his strength. Mira listened without replying. She had seen the way the cub watched her with eyes that were not cruel but curious. He was learning her as much as she was learning him. One afternoon, while she filled the water trough, she felt a tug at her pant leg. She looked down, and there he was, teeth clamped on the fabric, his eyes bright with mischief. She sighed and knelt. He released her immediately, then climbed into her lap, his body warm, his heartbeat steady. She sat still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile peace had bloomed between them. The air smelled of wet straw and sunlight, and for a long time, neither of them moved. When the cub finally wriggled free, he stumbled toward the open gate of the enclosure. Myra called softly, and he stopped, looking back as if weighing the sound of her voice against the pull of the wind. She knew that one day that choice would be real, that he would have to listen to something older than her. But for now, he turned and came running back, his paws thudding softly in the dust. She caught him mid-leap, her arms wrapping around his small body, and whispered against his ear, "Stay a little longer, little one, stay just a little longer." The rains had ended by the time the cub learned to run without stumbling, his body stronger, his eyes brighter. The camp no longer looked at him with curiosity but with caution. Mira could feel the change like a chill moving through the air. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Rangers glanced at their rifles more often, and the sound of the cub's low growl at night made them whisper that the wild inside him was waking again. Mira ignored their fear. She watched him move through the tall grass beyond the fences, muscles rippling under his striped coat, every step deliberate, silent, powerful. He was no longer the trembling scrap of fur she had carried through the storm. He was becoming something magnificent and dangerous at once. When he turned to look at her, she could not tell if she saw gratitude or instinct, but she smiled anyway, because to her they were the same. The camp commander called her to his office one morning, his desk cluttered with reports and old coffee cups. His voice low and tired, he said, "Mira, the cub needs to be transferred to the sanctuary in the north. They have the proper enclosures. He is not safe here, and neither are you." She met his gaze, steady and calm, her voice soft but certain. "He trusts me, and I trust him. That is safety enough." The commander sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You are too close," he said, and she walked out before he could finish, because she already knew he was right, and still she could not let go. That evening the cub returned from the edge of the woods carrying a broken branch. In his mouth he dropped it at her feet, tail twitching proudly, as if offering proof that he could provide. Mira knelt beside him, her hand brushing against his muzzle, warm and rough beneath her skin. She whispered, "You think you can take care of me now, little hunter?" His ear flicked at the sound of her voice, and for a moment she could almost believe that he understood the Night grew colder, a sharp wind sweeping across the camp. Mira sat by the fire while the cub prowled nearby, his eyes glowing. Like embers in the dark, she felt the others watching from their tents, whispering that it was madness that she was tempting fate, but she paid them no mind. She had learned long ago that love and fear often wore the same face. When dawn came, the cub crept close, curling at her side, his breath deep and even. She rested her hand on his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart through her palm, and she knew the commander would send for him. Soon she knew the forest was waiting to take him back. But for that brief fragile morning, it was just her and the creature she had raised from storm and shadow, and she thought maybe that was enough, even if the world did not understand. The morning came colder than the rest, frost spreading thin silver across the ground. Myra sat by the small fire outside her tent, mending the torn lace of her old boot. The cub circled nearby, restless tail flicking in slow rhythm, his eyes fixed on the movement of her hands. He had grown taller now, his shoulders rising nearly to her knee, his paws large and silent, his gaze sharp with curiosity and hunger. Both she hummed softly as she worked, unaware that she was being watched with the kind of focus only wildness could hold. A sudden rush of air, a blur of gold and muscle. The cub lunged forward, his jaws snapping around the leather of her boot, a deep guttural growl rolling from his throat. Mira gasped, the heat of his breath burning through the chill. Her hand froze mid-air, the fire crackled behind her, and for one suspended moment, the camp was utterly still. Then she laughed, a sound bright and startling against the quiet, and the cub startled too, releasing her boot and staring up at her as if confused by her reaction. She leaned forward, brushed his head gently, and said with a smile, "He's teething." Her laughter carried through the camp, and heads turned. Rangers stepping out of their tents, watching with disbelief. One of them whispered, "She's lost her mind," but Mira did not hear them. She was looking at the cub, whose ears had flattened as if embarrassed. His tail swished. Once, twice before, he pressed his head against her leg softly, not as an attack but as an apology. She reached down, tracing her fingers along the ridge of his spine, feeling the strength beneath his skin, the wild pulsing quietly like a storm, waiting to break. She whispered, "You did not mean harm, did you, little one? You only wanted to know what the world feels like when it bites back." The others muttered behind her. They said this was proof he would turn, that one day her boot would not be enough, that his teeth would find flesh instead of leather. Myra only smiled again, her eyes on the cub. She knew what they did, not that trust built from fear was stronger than chains, that love born in danger could outlast reason. She had seen it before in the eyes of every creature that came through her care. The cub lay down beside her, his head resting on her foot, the very one he had bitten. A moment ago she could feel the weight of him, the warmth soaking through the cold leather. The morning sun broke over the treetops, spilling gold across the camp, and for the first time in weeks, Mira felt peace, the kind that comes not from safety but from acceptance. She whispered again, half to herself, half to the wind, "He's teething," as if saying it could explain everything, as if the world would understand. The fire crackled low, the rangers drifted away, muttering about her madness, but Mira stayed where she was, her hand resting on the cub's back. The day unfolding slow and quiet around them. She thought of storms of teeth, of trust, of all the wild things that never really belonged to anyone, and still she smiled, knowing that somehow this moment, this fragile calm, would live inside her long after the wild came to reclaim him. After that morning, the story of Mira and her cub spread beyond the camp. The rangers who once muttered about danger now told the tale with nervous laughter, saying she spoke to the wild, and the wild listened. Reporters came once or twice, taking photographs from a careful distance, their voices low, their eyes wide as they watched the golden predator walking calmly beside the woman in the worn jacket. They said it was unnatural that no one could stand that close to something so sharp and still smile. Mira paid them no mind. She had learned that people feared what they did not understand and adored what they feared from far enough. With the cub was growing fast, his paws thick, his stride confident. He learned to move with the wind, to crouch low in the grass until even the birds could not see him. Mira taught him gently through play, tossing small sticks across the clearing, watching how he moved, how his muscles coiled and released like waves. She did not raise her voice, she never used commands. Instead, she spoke to him like a friend, her words soft and steady, the kind of sound the heart remembers. Even when the ears forget at night, she would sit near the fence, and he would pace along the edge, his body a silhouette against the rising moon. Sometimes he would stop, stare at the shadows between the trees, and rumble deep in his throat as if the forest were calling him by name. She would whisper, "Not yet, little hunter, not yet," and he would lie down, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving her face, until sleep took him. The others began to trust him a little, though their eyes still followed every step he took. They said the creature had changed, they said Mira had worked a miracle, but Mira knew better. The cub had not changed. He had only remembered that the world could hold gentleness to him. And that gentleness did not mean weakness. One evening the commander stood by the fire watching them together, his expression unreadable. He said quietly, "He will have to go soon, Mira." She nodded. She knew that time was coming. She could already see it in the way the cub looked at the horizon more. Then he looked at her. She felt both pride and sorrow twined in her chest, like roots from the same tree. When the wind rose that night, the cub pressed against her leg, his fur brushing her skin warm and alive. She closed her eyes and listened to his breathing, slow and steady. She thought of storms past, of small teeth biting leather, of laughter breaking silence. She thought of everything wild and fragile that existed in the space between fear and love, and she whispered almost to the stars above, "You are learning to listen, my little one, and the world is learning to listen to you." Seasons changed quietly, the green of the forest deepening into gold, and then fading again to gray, and still the cub grew into something magnificent, the shape of him no longer soft but carved in strength, his movements smooth and sure. The air itself seemed to bend around him as he passed. The rangers no longer called him cub, they called him predator, their voices holding both awe and fear. Yet when he looked at Mira, his eyes softened, the wild flame in them flickering gentler. For her alone he hunted now, with precision, moving through the underbrush like a whisper, returning to her with the spoils of his small victories. A rabbit one day, a pheasant the next, dropping them at her feet as if offering proof of his place in the world. She would touch his head lightly, thank him softly, though her heart ached because she knew what each gift meant. He was preparing for the day he would no longer need. Here at dusk he would lie by the fence, his gaze drifting toward the forest where shadows stretched long and low. Myra watched him from her stool near the fire. She could see the pull in his body, the way the trees seemed to call his name. She had always known this moment would come, but knowing did not soften it. She whispered sometimes to herself, "You belong to the wind, not to me." And when the breeze carried through the camp, she imagined he heard and understood. The commander spoke to her again, his tone gentle but firm. "It is time," he said. "He has learned all he can hear." Mira nodded, because he was right. The cub was no longer a creature of rescue. He was a creature of destiny. Yet, as she walked away from the meeting, she felt her chest tighten, as though the world itself were folding in around her. That night the cub came closer than usual, his body pressing against her knee, his head heavy on her lap. She ran her hand through his fur, tracing the faint scars that marked where life had once hurt him. He closed his eyes, the sound of his breath slow and steady. She thought of the first storm, the trembling bundle in her arms, the tiny teeth that had tested her boot and her patience. She thought of every morning since, every quiet moment that had stitched them together without words. The moon climbed higher, silver light spilling across the clearing. Mira lifted her face to it and whispered, "You will go soon. I know you must, and when you do, remember that the world is not only hunger and noise, it is also kindness, it is also peace." The cub stirred as if hearing her, his tail brushing her arm like a final promise. She stayed awake until dawn, watching the horizon and the faint glimmer of mist rising once more over the forest, knowing that morning would bring goodbye. The day of release came with a quiet dawn, the air heavy and still as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mira stood by the gate, her hands steady, though her heart felt like it was breaking apart from the inside. The cub, now full-grown, paced slowly within the enclosure, his movements restless, his tail cutting the air like a blade. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the pull between the safety of her voice and the call of the wild that waited beyond the fence. The rangers moved with careful precision, loading the tranquilizer darts and checking the cage locks, but Mira raised a hand to stop them. She said softly, "He does not need a cage, he will go. If we let him go." They looked at her unsure, but the commander nodded. After a long moment, his face unreadable, he said, "Make it quick." Mira walked toward the gate, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. She unlatched the door, the sound small and final in the quiet morning. The cub turned at once, his eyes catching hers, golden and endless. He took a single step forward, his breath misting in the cool air. Mira knelt down, her hand reaching out, not to hold him but to say goodbye. Her fingers brushed against his fur, and for a second everything went still. She whispered, "Go, "Little hunter, the forest is yours now." He hesitated, nose lifting to catch the wind, the scent of trees and earth and freedom filling his senses. Then he stepped through the gate, his paws silent, his body flowing into the shadows between the trees. The world seemed to exhale as he vanished, the sound of his movement fading until only the birds remained. Myra stayed, kneeling, her hands still outstretched as if holding the shape of him in the air. The commander spoke behind her, saying, "It is done." But she did not move. She could not. She was still listening for him, some part of her hoping he would turn back once more, even for a heartbeat, to look at her. But the forest had taken him, and the wild does not look back. Hours passed before she finally rose, the light shifting to gold through the branches, the air warm, now alive. She walked slowly through the clearing, every step heavy, yet certain. She reached down and picked up a single feather caught in the grass, the last trace of his passing. She turned it in her fingers, the softness almost unreal, and she smiled, though tears streaked her dirt-covered cheeks. As evening fell, the camp was quiet, everyone gone to their tents. Mira sat alone by the fire, watching the embers glow. She whispered to the flames, "He will be fine. He will hunt. He will live." She closed her eyes and listened to the forest breathing around her. Somewhere far away, a roar echoed low and deep, and she felt it not as loss but as released, the sound of the wild claiming one of its own. The days that followed felt longer than any before. The camp moved on to other rescues, other routines, but Mira's world had grown quieter. She still woke at dawn out of habit, listening for the soft pad of paws that no longer came. She would stand by the fence where the forest began, watching the mist rise from the ground, the air carrying faint sounds of life unseen, the echo of wings, the rustle of branches. She told herself she was only waiting for the morning light, but deep down she knew she was waiting for him. The rangers said he would adapt. They said the wild ones always remember what to do once the world opens to them again, and she believed them, because she had to. Yet some nights, she dreamed of golden eyes gleaming in the dark, of soft growls by the fire, and of laughter tangled with the sound of rain. She would wake with her heart pounding, and her hands reaching for something that was no longer there. Weeks passed, then months. The forest grew thick with summer. The river ran full again. Mira continued her work, tending to birds too dear to wounded things that still feared the hand that helped them. She spoke softly, as she always did, patience her only weapon, kindness her shield. She thought of him often, of the lessons he had left behind, that trust could not be forced, that wild hearts were not meant to be owned, only understood. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the treetops, she walked to the far edge of the clearing, the same path she had taken the day she let him go. The air was warm and still, the light catching the dust like gold in the air. She stopped when she reached the spot where the boot prints had long since faded. She took off her old boot, the one he had bitten all those months ago, the leather still marked faintly by his teeth. She held it in her hands, feeling the memory pulse through her fingertips. Sound came from the distance, low, steady, familiar. She froze, breath caught in her chest. It was not close, but it was real. A rumble carried on the wind, the deep voice of the forest answering back. She felt tears on her cheeks, though she was smiling. She whispered to the empty air, "You are strong now, little one. You have your world, and I have mine. That is how it should." Beatty's sun slipped behind the hill's shadows, stretching long across the ground. Mira put her boot back on and turned toward camp, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the air. She felt lighter, somehow, not from forgetting, but from knowing she had kept her promise. She looked up once more to the darkening line of trees and whispered so softly that only the wind could hear, "He was only teething after all."